This is the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, a roundtable discussion on contemporary issues in children's and young adult comics.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Paul, and we're two PhDs, on the way there, talking about comics.
Well, on today's program, we have the pleasure of talking about the state of children's and YA comics themselves, but also comics scholarship with one of the pioneers and finest scholars in comic studies, Dr. Charles Hatfield, and with his new colleague at Cal State Northridge, Dr. Krystal Howard. So in a few minutes, we'll play that roundtable that we just did with them. Mm-hmm. We're really excited about it. It was a great conversation.
Absolutely.
Just amazing.
What a privilege.
So It was a total privilege. So, but before we get to that wonderful part of the program, let's do a little bit of housekeeping. Paul, what do we have from DCBS Service this month for our young readers?
Well, we're sponsored by DCB Service, a discount comic book service, which, of course, we want you to go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And you always do find great discounts on DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off, and many other publishers' comics regularly go 20 to 35% off the list price, and there's specials and bundles that get up to 40 and 50% off the cover price, and even better discounts than that. So check out dcbservice.com and their sister site In Stock Trades this month, and you'd be able to find the DC Kids bundle for July, which has Scooby-Doo Where Are You 85, Scooby-Doo Team Up 30, and Looney Tunes 239 for $4.47, 50% off the cover price. And there's a Marvel Generations bundle that has this exciting new Marvel Comics event going on, and that's just $16.99, 45% off the retail price, and you're just going to find all kinds of great discounts at DCBS.
That's right, and in that bundle, that Marvel bundle, I just do want to mention Ms. Marvel, Miles Morales Spider-Man. So for our young readers, some of the really good comics that are out there being put out by Marvel. So that part is exciting. All right, Paul, well, without further ado, let us go to the roundtable.
All right.
Well, welcome to the Comics Alternative Podcast for Young Readers Roundtable on the contemporary state of children's and YA comics. We have two esteemed guests with us today. The first is Dr. Charles Hatfield, who's a professor at California State University Northridge, or CSUN, as I've come to understand it is called.
Yep.
And we also have with us Dr. Krystal Howard, who is a recent graduate of Western Michigan University and now a professor dual appointed in English and Liberal Studies at CSUN. And a little disclaimer before we begin, my former dissertation mentee, so I'm very proud of Krystal. And so Charles and Krystal, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves and your involvement in comics?
Which one of us will start, Krystal?
You can go ahead, Charles, or I can go ahead, whichever.
Well, I don't know how long I've been teaching comics. I think I started introducing them into composition courses, essentially writing workshops, back in the early 90s when I was a teaching associate at UConn in my MA and PhD years, and I did not teach a course wholly devoted to comics until I came here to CSUN. In 2001, the then chair of the department was kind enough to give every one of us new hires a senior seminar on topics of our choice that first semester I came here, and that was the first time that I stumbled my way through trying to fashion and deliver a syllabus all about comics. That was 2001, and my teaching life in that area has accelerated since then. Krystal, what about you in terms of like classroomy stuff. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so I first became really fascinated with comics when in my undergraduate children's and young adult lit class, I had a professor who taught a lot of comics. So Phoebe Gluckner's Diary of a Teenage Girl was kind of the first really, really interesting approach to comics that got me really excited about the field. And when I came to Western Michigan University for my MFA and my PhD, and I got to work with the wonderful Gwen, I got to take her comics class. And then recently in the past year, I did a teaching assistantship with Gwen in her comics class. And this coming fall, for the first time, I'll get to teach, in addition to the children's literature class that I'm teaching, the English 333, which is CSUN's comics and graphic novels course, which I'm super excited about. So
it's great that you'll be teaching that. We have a growing cohort of people here, and it's nice to have a full-time hire coming right in and teaching that straight away. I guess I had a comparable experience in that my dissertation director, Tom Roberts at the UConn Department of English, was teaching a graphic novels course in the 90s, and I and my friend and colleague, fellow dissertator Gene Cannonberg, both ended up working with Tom and guest lecturing occasionally in his graphic novels course. So it wasn't quite a TA-ship for that course, but I did a number of guest lectures there working with my dissertation director, and that made all the difference. So I'm the founding president of the Comics Study Society, author of a couple of books about comics. Thank you for that. And I've been engaged pretty steadily teaching comics since 2005, and I can't remember a time when I wasn't reading them. So it's just been It started out as something at CSUN that I hoped would be an acceptable sideline to my colleagues. It's ended up not being a sideline. It's actually become the backbone of most of what I'm doing here. I was hired to teach, and I do still often teach a course in children's literature and then other courses besides. But as enrollment levels have shifted and as my teaching assignments have shifted over the last 15 to 16 years, I've been in and out of different phases, and over the last 5 years or so, the comics course has been happening every single semester as opposed to once a year, and that seems to have given me a kind of toehold there. So I don't have a children's literature course per se to teach this fall, but I will have 2 such classes to teach in the spring along with a section of comics. So those things are weaving in and out.
Wow, Paul, one thing that we haven't really talked about that much is how when you started working with comics. I don't know that story.
Yeah, well, first of all, what a thrill to be in this conversation.
I know.
And I'm just super excited to be here and have gleaned so much over the years from, well, certainly your work, Charles, and then more recently, Krystal, from your piece in graphic novels for children and young adults in Gwen and Michelle Anna Bates' book. So this is super fun and a thrill for me.
It's great. This is a conversation that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago, This would not have happened. Forgive me for interrupting, but I just had to reflect on that.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that we're talking now about a field that is emerging and emerged and burgeoning, certainly. So it's very exciting. But to come to your question, Gwen, and to introduce myself a bit, I smuggled comics into my reading diet as a kid. I was an immigrant, and I think they were my exposure to really much of the world, past and present, and of all sorts, all kinds, newspaper strips, Dick Tracy, The Punisher, you have it. So really it was, and then of course simultaneous to that, and as I was growing up, it was really sort of a reconciling with the world through literature and through reading, and so became an English teacher. My undergrad was at Berkeley, my credential was also at Berkeley, and now my doctorate is at Berkeley, so very, very homegrown in Berkeley. And always, as you were saying, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there's almost a parallel reading life for me of, reading literature, engaging in scholarship, and then always being a voracious comics reader. And somewhere, Charles Hatfield resided in that space between those things. When I'd be hanging around, Moe's bookstore in Berkeley, and find that, you were there bridging those for me, the theoretical and conceptual and literary, as well as, the stuff I was reading in the funny pages, so to speak. So really now, I'm a language and literacy researcher, and I work in English language arts classrooms with adolescents. And my thinking is really around comics as multimodal literature, as means of a kind of subversive, almost underground way that kids develop critical literacy in the world. And that's why I'm excited for this talk.
If I may, that line about parallel reading lives really rings a bell with me, because I was going through all of my coursework and my comps, and even into the dissertation prospectus stage at UConn, with no notion of writing a dissertation about comics, with a very, in some ways, traditional though rich grad school education in literature and in rhetoric, particularly through my constant composition teaching. And so I had no notion of writing about comics, and finally I decided that I guess I exerted my will and tried to make those parallel lines intersect in some way. And there was not a precedent for it in the department there, so it was a little strange. But I just wanted to do it. So much of my intellectual energy was going into that other track, and a moment came where I thought, well, I want to align these and see if I can get recognition for this work that I'm doing outside of what my department had acknowledged. And so that sense of, which meant partly giving up the idea that comics were a relief and a release and an escape from every other thing. It meant saying that they were also work, which is something that's still a negotiation point in my life, I guess, my work and my hobby and all that. But it was great to try to bring those things together.
Yeah.
It's interesting talking about this, because my struggle this summer is trying to begin to work on a history of how comics and children's literature work together. And really, Charles, you were the groundbreaker for that, 2006, especially your essay on the new comic studies in children's literature, and the concerns about really both fields not necessarily acknowledging each other, but especially traditional children's literature not acknowledging comics, and the need to remedy that. So I can really point to you as the person who has inspired my current scholarship. And so I'm really grateful that you made that move into making comics more a part of what you do, because it changed the way I view children's literature for sure.
Likewise, and thank you for that. I want to acknowledge somewhat belatedly that I got all kinds of encouragement and rhetorical and substantive assist or advice with that line in the Unicorn essay back then, courtesy of Jan Cecina, and also got a good rhetorical sitting on my shoulder kind of advice from my then CSUN colleague now at San Diego State, Joseph Thomas. Both of them helped me avoid some pitfalls, I think, in that piece. And they were both, of course, were and very much are engaged in children's literature and children's culture scholarship. And that kind of help really allowed me to see how I might write a piece that would bridge some intellectual communities that I was part of. We were so busy; it's so hard to work in multiple spheres at once, obviously in academia. But I had the help of very active and committed children's literature scholars in getting that piece toward the kind of deliverable point. So.
Well, before we start in on thinking a little bit about the current field of children's and YA comics, Charles, I understand that this weekend you were at Comic-Con, and we'd love to hear about your experiences there and anything that you can report back to us about how children's comics are being received. I think everyone pretty much knows the answer to that, which is pretty strongly, but I'd love to hear about your experiences.
Well, I was there in a very abbreviated way. I'm often at San Diego Con longer, My trip was cut short somewhat, and I was there as a Jack Kirby partisan because it's the Kirby centenary as well as the Will Eisner centenary, and as invested Kirby scholar and friend and advisor of the Jack Kirby Museum and Research Center, I just wanted to be there, and I spent a lot of time at the museum's booth talking to people about Kirby, and I didn't actually even walk the floor, the exhibit hall floor, until Saturday morning after I'd been there a couple of nights. So it was an unusual con. But here's a couple of things I could share with you, though, about the young readers focused activities at Comic-Con. One is I have in front of me the schedule, a schedule that I poured over a lot before I went, even though I ended up not being able to go to very many of the events. Mm-hmm. But I'm looking at the slate of events that took place off-site, that is outside of the San Diego Convention Center in San Diego's Central Library. This year, programming was running in the Central Library all the way from Wednesday night or preview night through Sunday. So for the entire run of the con, of course, off-site events in general have been growing at the con, but it's notable that there was this whole run of librarian-focused and often young reader-focused programming happening at the San Diego Central Library. And I'll just read you the titles of a select few of these events that took place at the Central Library that are obviously relevant either to young readers or to comics in education. Teaching with Comics, an interactive workshop for educators that was co-facilitated by my colleague Susan Kirtley at Portland State. Creators, Libraries, and Literacy. Young Adult Graphic Novel and Manga Collection Essentials, or what titles every library should carry. Graphic Novel and Manga Programming for Tweens and Teens in our diverse communities for any budget. How to judge what is appropriate in comics, or what does T for teen really mean? Using comics to support different learning styles in the classroom. From Asterix to Zeus, developing an essential kids graphic novel collection. Handling challenges and bans to comics. Read Like a Girl, or middle grade fiction for girls and parenthetically boys. Let's see, what else? Content literacy, or teaching STEM with comics. Comic Book Legal Defense Fund sponsored panel on equipping teachers to defend comics. Graphic novels graphic novels in the high school library. Superheroes and comics can transform learning. Comics in classroom and instruction. Developing comics for social impact and change. Inspiring young readers through graphic novels. Comics in secondary ed. That's a selection of the events that took place at the Central Library, and of course there were also young reader themed events and creator spotlights happening within the main convention center as well. So that's one interesting fact, and that probably would serve to reconfirm, I think, what you were just suggesting, that we know that there's this kind of almost rapturous, certainly very, very busy reception of children's and young adult comics within the culture represented by Comic-Con. And one other factoid here, I guess, is that in the Eisner Awards this year, the 3 young reader-directed categories, that is early readers up to age 8, kids ages 9 to 12, and teens ages 13 to 17, those 16 nominated books were published by 16 different publishers. So besides having the usual suspects, First Second, Scholastic, Toon, Flying Eye Books, and Paper Cuts, we also had quite a few other young reader nominated comics, even from art comics presses like Koyama Press, and in the teen category, notably DC, Marvel, Image, Archie, and Oni, which are very direct market centered publishers. Right. One doesn't necessarily think of in the original graphic novel for young readers business, but lots of nominees there. So, and of course the creators. I mean, some of the usual suspects. Raina Telgemeier, of course, another Eisner. People like Mark Crilly and James Sturm and Chris Schweitzer and Jennifer Holm and Matthew Holm, all familiar from children's and young adult comics publishing. But a lot of other voices never previously nominated in these young reader focused categories. So, for what that's worth, I've got this Eisner Award program right in front of me with some exclamation marks of surprise that I marked in it. So, yeah.
I think that's a fantastic set of artifacts that exhibit the ways that comics is. There's a way that even in discussing your careers, both of you, Gwen and Charles, and certainly I'm sure Krystal, you feel this as well. you're to talk about comics with children's literature is to kind of live in the in-between or the margins or the interstices of these different fields. But I think what you're describing is the ways that it is that little space in the margins is growing into a kind of, I don't know, its own mainstream, its own like very vibrant segment that, I feel like whenever I'm in this conversation, I've become conditioned to trying to defend our presence here and not need it anymore.
Yeah, although it's interesting too, the shift when you start to have data that you can collect over time, it's interesting to note the shift even from last year in terms of the nominees in the children's categories for the Eisners. I've noticed the reemergence of DC, Marvel, Ani as categories that really, as publishers that really weren't part of the categories even last year. And so I think it shows you just the way that quote unquote mainstream comics publishers are now coming back into a realization that focusing on kids is not only not a bad thing, but it's a multi-million-dollar industry. Right. Admittedly, Raina Telgemeier was worth $10.3 million of it last year. Right. One comics creator. But the reality is that the field is growing and also just the importance of webcomics. Bird Boy that won for best webcomic was something I think Andy and I featured that last year on this show. And it certainly could be called a kid-oriented comic. So it's amazing the reach of children's comics today versus even maybe 5 years ago. This is the 15th anniversary of the Get Graphic at Your Library panel and set of activities that the American Library Association did that a lot of people, myself included, look at as being sort of a watershed event in the contemporary renaissance of children's comics. But I agree, Charles. I mean, can you imagine us even having this conversation with this group of people 15 years ago? Right. That's, I think, and a scholar such as Krystal coming into the field sort of new to everything. I mean, geez, Krystal, for you, this is probably a norm that for us seems like something that's kind of exciting and exceptional.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I was saying previously, children's literature and comics have always been intertwined in my educational background. It was the children's literature scholars who were bringing comics to my attention. And I mean, that is shaping the way that I develop my own courses in both fields. So, right.
That's awesome. That's incredible.
Yeah,
and I guess
Charles, can you imagine one of our professors bringing a comic into the classroom? Comics, I mean, children slid into the classroom. The argument that I had to go through with my committee, I mean, they were ultimately very supportive, and I'm thankful for their support, but I had to really create a pretty strong justification for writing a dissertation on girls' culture. That was back in the mid-1990s. So, it's amazing how things have changed.
Well, and a lovely thing has happened at my alma mater, UConn, where my friend from graduate school, Kate Capshaw, president incoming of the Children's Literature Association, and one of the great children's literature scholars that I know, has certainly been teaching comics, and there's a kind of growing sort of graphic narrative effort there on the UConn campus. So I see all that happening very much now, and it's a delight to communicate with I think really distinguished scholars in children's literature studies, and have these conversations about comic art, about graphic narrative and graphic novels. So yeah, it's a little head turning, spinning, dizzying, weird, and cool. It's very cool. So.
Well, let's talk for a minute, maybe about some of your favorite comics creators who are currently writing for children and young adults. What are you reading? What's working well with your students? What sort of texts might our listeners want to be looking at, and that have come out in the last couple of years?
I'd be happy to start. I actually just finished up with the March trilogy. I know I'm a little bit behind, but last night I just finished book 3. And this is kind of on the heels of thinking a little bit about some of the scholarship at the Children's Literature Association conference, as Charles brought up Kate Capshaw from UConn. And I actually sat in on her presentation. She was on the same panel as you, right, Gwen?
That's correct, yeah.
And I was thinking a lot about her presentation and the way that she talked about the representation of children and young people in the March trilogy and how they're drawn. So I was really paying attention to that as I was finishing up book 2 yesterday and moving on to book 3 as well. And just really kind of trying to decide. I know I want to teach one of the March books in the comics and graphic novel class, and I'm torn between whether or not I want to do book 1 or book 3. Book 3 was really fabulous, though. I found myself just reading through it so quickly and then going back to different images and in the other 2 books. And thinking a little bit about the depiction of children and young people. And that's kind of a thread that I noticed permeating through the entire course that I'm working on developing right now, the comics and graphic novel course. I'm noticing that I've chosen a lot of texts that do show young people, whether they're children's comics like Deutsch's Hereville and Yang's American-Born Chinese, Miss Marvel, or if they're, adult comics that just portray children like Bechdel's Fun Home. And even I just started looking through the graphic novel adaptation of Kindred this morning, which is very powerful, and just noticing also the depictions of children in that text. So that's what I'm reading right now, just working through book 3 of March. Just picked up Kindred this morning. It's really great.
I have a particular fondness for Luke Pearson's work. He was nominated for an Eisner this year for one of the Hilda books, Hilda and the Stone Forest. I first encountered his work in a small album called Everything We Miss, which struck me as a very Chris Ware high formalist sort of comic, and with that same sense of aching, of loneliness, and of alienation that one finds in Chris Ware, who's basically a comics poet laureate of loneliness, I think. And there's a wonderful but disconcerting book by Luke Pearson called Everything We Miss. But he's better known for Hilda and the Stone Forest, which Nobrow has been publishing through its Flying Eye imprint in a kind of tall, thin European BD format familiar to any Tintin or Asterix reader. And I just really love reading Luke Pearson's work, not only because it has that whiff of BD in the Tintin tradition and that strong touch of Moominland, that sort of Janssen influence, which I'll describe lamely as sort of Scandinavian because I really can't peg it. But also because the interactions between, for example, Hilda and her mother in the strip include, tetchiness and anger and frustration and love and reassurance and all the ordinary things of parent-child relations in a way that is fairly unguarded and not sort of felted over too much. And I really dig those books. I haven't had the opportunity to teach them. Usually when I've taught graphic novels in my children's literature courses, I've taught precisely that. Graphic novels that are a little longer. Let's say Reina's Drama, Gene Yang's Boxers and Saints, or American-Born Chinese, and often I've taught Lat's memoir Kampong Boy in children's literature, right, coming right off of other texts about sort of working class childhood and child labor in my comics classes. I've turned to Lat's depiction of sort of 1950s Malaysia, which are wonderful books, not very current, but I always have to put in a word for Muhammad Noor Khalid, Lat. Those are amazing depictions of a particular, very situated, very particular kind of childhood. I'm trying to think what else I have been reading. I have a Hilda book on my bedside table, so that's why that immediately came to my mind. Of course, the March trilogy that, as Krystal mentioned, is really a watershed text. There are a number of tune books that I'm really fond of. I've taught relatively few of those, but there are a number of them that I'm very fond of, and I've always enjoyed Eleanor Davis's work for young readers, even though that no longer seems to be her center of gravity or specialty particularly. She has a forthcoming comic for adults, but she has published 2 books with tune, including Flop to the Top with Drew Wang.
I love that.
So I most recently read by James Parks and Ben Costa. Ben's I confess, a former student of mine, Rickety Stitch Volume 1, which is a nutty book. I can't be at all objective about it because I still have many comics in my office that Ben made in my class, right? So I'm invested there. But his cartooning is so wild, and there's a lot of that's off color and a little strange about Rickety Stitch Volume 1. In fact, some of the Amazon customer reviews indicate that this couldn't possibly be for the young because it has these off color gags. But I think it's a wonderful piece of high-spirited stuff that reminds me of what it was like to play Dungeons and Dragons, which I haven't done in a long time. It's loopy, slap-happy stuff, but it has these moments of gravity that I kind of enjoy, and that's often what I'm drawn to in comics for young readers is these moments of gravity. It happens in Jeff Smith's Bone, where it's a slap-happy Looney Tunes like Lark at first, but when the big reveal comes and you realize you're actually reading an epic fantasy that has designs on you, like The Lord of the Rings, the consequences of that are not easily brushed aside, and I enjoy the emotional gravity of those discoveries in text like that.
Yeah. What lists? Gwen, can I throw the question?
You're the only one of us who has an actual young reader right now the midst. So what are you 2 reading?
Oh yeah, we've been reading a ton. She watched the Eisners with me on Twitter as they were being announced. My 6-year-old daughter and I read comics together a lot, and so that's what Gwen is referencing there. And Gwen, I definitely want to throw the question back to you as well. I'm so curious what's on your desk right now. But yeah, we've been reading Hilda certainly, and I'm trying to think what she's been up to. Actually, she's been pretty into some non-comics literature lately, but. No, actually, some of what we've been going through is what's on my desk right now, because I'm preparing to do this study in the fall with some of these texts in middle school classrooms, and my daughter just can't. So she saw Anya's Ghost, and I had a moment of, I don't know if that's going to be for you, hun. And I couldn't, she snuck behind my back and grabbed it, and she loved it. She was totally absorbed, and it was obviously a little scary, but I think
really education in the Gothic.
Absolutely. We're going to be using your piece in our class, Krystal. So
that's
really
fabulous.
Yeah, we'll take parts of that and then parts of Charles's work. We're also going to be reading Gaiman and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I think, we have the pleasure, my daughter and I have the pleasure of just kind of swimming through these vast worlds. And as I watch her do it, I'm realizing, similar to what I experienced as a kid, but in a very different way because of the contemporary comic scene, just what an exposure to, as you were saying, Krystal, the Gothic through that, or, a kind of humor through Gene Yang's work, or, just a huge wide variety of that sort of Scandinavian sense of adventure and wonder as she reads Hilda. So that's all there. But Gwen, what are you got on your desk, and curious what your thoughts are about these lists?
I have about a 12,000-pound rock on my desk right now, which is this book manuscript I'm trying to finish. So it's so ironic because I'm writing about children's and young adult comics, so I don't have time to read any.
Right.
That's almost the truth, and it's sad. But I will say one of the things that I'm currently working on that really interests me, and you almost alluded to it there, really, Paul, with your discussion about whether your daughter was ready for Anya's Ghost, is I am, and Krystal, what you're thinking about focusing your teaching on, I am very interested in this question about the depiction of children in texts where clearly the intended audience would be young readers versus where that's not the case. And a book came out this year. I know, Charles, you've talked about it. Other critics have talked a lot about it. It's called My Favorite Thing is Monsters. It's a 2-part comic by Emil Ferris. And that book, I read it on an airplane, which I have was really a weird experience because for folks who haven't yet had a chance to look at it, it's the style of it is very powerful. The line style is extremely powerful. The color is extremely intense, and the story is heart-wrenching, literally in some ways. And the airplane is maybe not the best place to encounter it this time because not only was I blown away by it, but it's this depiction of the claustrophobia that can sometimes attend childhood and the experience of being a child. And there's two other books that came out this year that I would put in the same category. One is Panther by Brecht Evans.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
He's a Belgian comics creator. This was translated and brought out by Drawn and Quarterly. So that book has had a really profound impact on how I'm thinking about the depiction of children in comics. And then the third book in that grouping is a text that is also kind of intense in its depiction of childhood. And I'm completely blanking on it now because I'm over 50. Oh, my God. I just wrote on it like 2 days ago. Help me, someone. Help me.
Any hints to?
Graphic memoir, fiction?
Oh, I've got it. It's Nick Drosno's Beverly. Sorry.
Yes.
And so all three of them are presenting either children who are disturbed themselves or in very troubled childhoods and family situations that are super troubled. And it's given me a lot of thought. I've been thinking a lot about the way that childhood is depicted, say, in those texts versus the way it's been depicted in some of the popular texts we've been talking about. And there are two books that have come out that I think maybe are bridging that gap. In other words, the authors are putting in some of the darker elements that we know are part of growing up, but are doing it in a way that I think it can still make it into the bookstores and libraries and homes of actual young readers. And those two authors are Eric Orchard, who is amazing. He is going to be so big, I believe. He's incredible. His book, Bear the One-Headed Troll, came out last year. And first, second books, of course, because they're kind of on the cutting edge in some ways. And it's a text that looks at childhood and the vulnerability of children in some really daring ways, in ways that are terrifying, I think, to adults and to kids, maybe for different reasons. And the other person you actually already mentioned, Charles, and that is Drew Weinig, I think is how you say his name. Or the creepy case files of Margot Malou is asking kids to think about how they could be completely monstrous themselves. In other words, how they are afraid of things, but in their fear and the way that they respond to that fear, they can act like monsters too. They can encroach on others. They can be really, really problematic little figures. And so, those two, that's really what I'm playing around with right now, is just thinking about what can make it into discourse that's put forward for kids, what authors are kind of trying to push those boundaries. So that's sort of where I am right now.
I'm looking at the Eric Orchard book even now, Amazon.com, and I realize it's a book I haven't read, nor have I talked to anyone about it, and but I do remember seeing it and paging through it. It's really quite striking, so I'll take your recommendation. When you were speaking, Gwen, two intertexts of sorts came to mind. Panther by Brecht Evans, which is beautiful and terrifying. I would love to teach that alongside Calvin and Hobbes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's something about the imaginary friend dynamic that becomes really genuinely alarming in Panther, like what is going to happen here? I mean, it's not necessarily an imaginary friend. It's not necessarily a friend. I don't know if it's imaginary. What's happening in that book is really intense. And then with my favorite thing is monsters, it's Harriet the Spy.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? I'm totally thinking about Harriet the Spy. Louise Fitzhugh's great Harriet the Spy, because the young girl who renders herself as a werewolf in Emile Ferris's book really sets out to be this sort of private detective. She gets her gear going, and she starts. It's like, wow, okay. And there's a queer subtext in the reception of Harriet the Spy. There's a lot of, and this is certainly happening in Emile Ferris's book. So there's something there about queer girlhood and investigating. including poking into the lives of grown-ups, which is really cool. I would love to teach Harriet the Spy and Emil. I don't know what course I would be able to do that in, because the Ferris book, as you said, is a really testing the waters kind of book, presumably for older readers. But yeah, those are great.
Well, Ethan said that he was actually referencing Calvin and Hobbes to a certain extent. So, Charles, that's spot on.
Wow.
Spot on. Get it, leopard? Sorry.
Okay.
Well done. See what you did there.
It wasn't even very good. It was like an off-animal-like reference, but still, it was close enough.
Yeah.
But the only other thing I'll say that really is, for me, it's not a quandary, but it's something that I'm working through, and I don't know if the three of you are working through this as well, but comic studies itself, in the North American context at least, I think it's something of a crossroads as well, as we're continuing to try to define what it means when we pick up a comic and we choose to write about it as a scholar. What are we attending to? What are we not attending to? Those sorts of questions are, I think, paramount for those of us working in that field. But then in the field of children's literature, we're also, I think, at a watershed period regarding representation, authenticity, authority, and so it's both an exciting time to be a scholar trying to span multiple different types of sort of literature and scholarship, but it's also kind of terrifying. I say this as someone who, it's different. The way I approach teaching children's comics and thinking about children's comics with my pre-service teachers in the courses that I teach, that's very different than what I'm doing as a scholar right now. And that disconnect is fine, but I'm just saying I'm feeling that. In other words, as I'm trying to continually define what it is that I'm doing as a scholar, that's really the thing that is the most vexed for me. So.
Yeah, in terms of thinking about the way that these fields kind of cross, I'm really interested to see. I'm teaching two of the same texts in the children's literature that I am in the comics course. So I'm doing Deutsch's Heerville, How Merca Got Her Sword, and Yang's American-Born Chinese. I've taught American-Born Chinese in the children's lit class many times, but this will be the first time I'm teaching Heerville. But I'm really interested to see how the comics students and the children's literature students approach these two texts, and to see if there are any differences in the way that they come to the texts, based upon the ways that we're coming to the courses very differently. So I'm just excited for that kind of exploration.
It's true, there's a difference in mindset. And as I look back over my own teaching, both in comics-themed courses and in children's literature-themed courses, there is some overlap with text, but I confess they've sort of been hived off. There are texts I've tended to teach in one and not the other, and I don't know why that is. I have done in my comics class The Secret Science Alliance by Eleanor Davis, which is a type of book that she'll probably not produce again, a wonderfully busy and inventive children's graphic novel that she did a handful of years ago. And I taught that alongside her book of short comic stories for adults, How to Be Happy, which I think is one of the great comics volumes of the last decade. And I put those two together just so that they might see an artist working in many different registers, and hopefully that there would be a kind of salutary shock from seeing that. And often there was. I feel like I have as yet unfulfilled opportunities to bring texts that are marketed as or are known as children's texts into my comics class. But I always, when I teach Keiji Nakazawa's work, discuss whether or not his Hiroshima memoir, I Saw It, is in fact a children's text. And that is something that has been a lead-off discussion point early in my comics course these last several years. Historically it was published in a special edition of Shonen Jump, Boys Jump. It is a children's comic, certainly by Japanese publishing standards, but it's in many ways harrowing and nightmarish, and so that's an interesting discussion. I think my next move is to bring Keiji Nakazawa into my children's literature class with its kind of horrific true-life depictions of the aftermath of the atomic bombing. And so I think that's kind of where I'm going to go next, because I have a huge stack of these Nakazawa books in my office, and they never fail to be super teachable. So.
One of the things that inspires me to think about, and this whole conversation has, is that, there's a way where, especially for children's and young adults literature, comics is part of a field-wide pivot to, legitimacy or canonization. But as they do so, the books that we're talking about do so, there's also this aspect of them that they're always self-referencing and sort of meta-aware of the sort of lowered or demeaned status of comics previously. I'm thinking of Chris Pizzino's scholarship. And, so many of the works that we're talking about do self-reference the marginality of comics as a kind of text, or, just like stuff that we have to go pick up at the drugstore and hide from our parents. And I think that actually that's such an important element, that as these things become part of our syllabi and our canons, are still really vital to them, because as I use these texts with kids that are, you could call them from non-dominant communities, there's a sense in which the ways that comics feel and are a kind of rebel literacy or literature is a part of their ability to connect with them and to identify with the monstrousness of being, children, or being in these marginalized communities. That incipient quality in them is like, we can't lose that as they become, branded with awards, and as we stick these stickers of how lauded they are critically.
I feel that way too, although I must say I think almost the whole apparatus of children's literature as a business is meant to help us lose that. Yeah, it's a legitimization machine, right? If not a gentrification machine. And so, Chris Pizzino's book, Arresting Development, is so interesting because it talks about the graphic novel as a means of gentrification and adultification of comics. Right. And the one challenge I had for Chris Pizzino while the work was in manuscript was, the graphic novel is like the children's publishing genre par excellence now, right? So you kind of, it was initially pushed as a way of adultifying comics, but the whole discourse about graphic novels is different than what it was when Will Eisner was pushing that kind of legitimacy argument through. There's still a legitimacy argument, but it is so much an important sector and category in children's publishing, which is odd given that the real purchase that the idea of the graphic novel got within among comics creators was that it was going to somehow make comics reading safe for adults. I think that children's publishing is the most prolific area of original non-serialized graphic novels, though, isn't it, at this point?
I think it represents, is it 40%? Maybe more. Maybe it's 60, and I have the numbers flipped, of revenue last year. I have the figures somewhere, but Charles, you're not incorrect in that. This is really what has helped a lot of the other less well-known publishers stay afloat in some ways, is through, all you need is one Raina Talgemeyer.
All you need is one Lumberjanes.
Right. And you're set. Other than you can open up the door to other more experimental comics creators. So it's really funny because, one of the things that has been really frustrating to me a little bit is the untouchability of someone like Raina Talgemeyer. She's been pretty much insulated from some of the critique of her last novel. And it really leads me to wonder not only what her next text will be, but what its reception will be. But on the other hand, the fact that she sold so many comics has helped other comics creators make the argument for the viability of children's comics and to put their work forward. So it's really interesting the way this field is sorting out in that way. But I will be interested to see how much more conventional mainstream comics are. That whole concept of the alternative comics, how they developed. Charles, you are of course the absolute expert on this, but it's interesting to me to see now sort of a move towards canonization of certain authors and publishers, and that's why it was sort of interesting to see the Eisners this year and to see that there were so many different publishers represented, because if you had looked at last year's list and then you look at this year's list, it's entirely different. Last year it was a very small handful of publishers that were being put forward. And this year it was like, wow, Paul and I think we talked about that on our last show. So,
yeah.
Yeah. And of course,
it's interesting. For example, Debbie Reese very strongly criticized Ghosts by Raina Telgemeier, not recommending it. I'm referring back to her blog, American Indians and Children's Literature, .com, and Debbie Reese is a well-known voice in conversations about not only American Indians but also of minoritized people in children's literature generally. And I do think that Raina Telgemeier's work has been received so rapturously because she's actually a phenomenon. And she, it's not that she'll be untouchable in the long term critically. It's just that she so much is invested in hopes for the future of children's comics and children's publishing generally that Raina Telgemeier is a very important figure right there on the crest of a wave, and there's something that's kind of fraught about the reception of that. But you wouldn't have known any of those criticisms based on the reception of Telgemeier's latest at the Eisner Awards or at Comic-Con. So.
Right. And again, I think that maybe that's the venue where that's not going to happen, just because there's such a desire to keep this going. And understandably, I mean, I really want to point to the fact that even though they're not perfect, the March trilogy is a really important development. It's a way that comics are entering the classroom again in vast ways. I mean, if you think about almost every kid who goes through New York public schools is going to have read at least one volume of that series.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's powerful. That's an amazing reach for comics. And I think it bodes well, especially in a place like New York City where so many kids maybe have never even had the opportunity to own books, to have these books provided to them, that they're going to get to really have a chance to learn more about comics. It's super exciting. So I'm not trying to sort of throw water on that. I'm just saying that everything is at this point where now things are going to start to develop in such a way where we're just expecting that there will be lots of comics releases every year. And there's a lot of young people in art school who are now specifically focusing on becoming comics creators for children and young adults. And so it just is going to be interesting to see how this whole field sorts itself out.
I think a curiosity for me stemming from that is, what do you all see as the frontiers of teaching comics? Like pedagogically, what are the ways that people are dealing with what these texts present and taking advantage of that in the classroom?
Well, I'm going to just leap in real quickly, and I'll leave it to you. All I want to say is, if my students come into my class with no knowledge of comics, and for where I am geographically in the Midwest, that's about 90% of them, they leave absolutely on fire and eager to learn more, and they want to teach more. And in my student evaluations this last year, I received like 20 comments on children's comics. Almost every other text was not mentioned, but students said, these changed my life. I can't believe it. I wish I'd known about this sooner. I'm going to use this in my classes. So I feel really good about that. Now I'll turn it back to everybody else.
Well, Krystal, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, sorry. One thing that I really was trying to do with the comics that I chose for the children's literature course was to choose authors that were really involved in the comics world beyond just their text, right? So choosing Jean Lewin Yang because he's the national ambassador for young people's literature, and he has a bunch of other initiatives going on beyond just his work with American-born Chinese, which is an older work of his, right? And one reason I chose that was so I could introduce them to some of his newer work, like Secret Coders, but also his Reading Without Walls initiative, and then choosing Barry Deutsch because he's fascinating in that he produces those web comics that are really more political and for adults, and to think about how those are pairing. In terms of other works that I've been interested in thinking about teaching, the March trilogy, as well as the Kindred adaptation, I'm really interested in the way that collaboration is happening among comics artists and writers. And I just think that those are two of the newer texts that I'm teaching in the comics class. But yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
I'm thinking about using the Kindred adaptation in my time travel themed science fiction course this fall as well. So maybe we could get a kind of exchange going there.
That would be great.
Have our students talk to one another. That would be cool. I was thinking about some of the other work that you have done in your published research, Krystal, and in the classroom about other kinds of books that are relatively unusual or sometimes considered outliers in form, such as the verse novels that you've studied, and how comics look so interesting within that mix. And it occurs to me that at the intersection of comics and children's literature, and one of the things that we might be looking toward is the way those texts mobilize different forms in order, and in some ways, at least at first blush, seemingly complex forms, in order to address complex identities. I mean, as we look for the, you were talking, Gwen, about a watershed in children's literature study as well as in comics study, and I'm thinking of the We Need Diverse Books movement. I'm thinking of Phil Nell's forthcoming volume was The Cat in the Hat Black. I'm thinking about how that will helpfully build upon work by people like Kate Capshaw and Robert Bernstein's work, interrogating race in children's literature and culture. It feels like comics, with their propensity for dealing with fragmented identities, multiple selves, mixed messages, you can call it cross-discursive, multimodal, all the various terms that we use to describe the word and image mix and the image and image mix, that tension-filled form is a great way to address identities in a way that doesn't resolve out in some simple way. If you look at American-Born Chinese, with its way of using structural divisions in the story, so divided, in fact, that they almost appear to be completely unrelated stories at first, in order to tell a story about social identity complexity. And then if you look at something like Jacqueline Woodson's Great Brown Girl Dreaming, her verse memoir, where, again, different parts of the family, different cities, different perspectives, religious and secular, in the book are all juxtaposed through these lovely short lyric poems, which are allowed to collide with one another without being resolved in any one particular poem. I mean, I don't know about you, Krystal, but that's one of the things I really enjoyed about that. And comics can work that kind of magic as well, through juxtaposition without pat resolution.
Yeah, one analogy that I think has been really helpful in terms of thinking about comics and the verse novel, both of them are really interesting forms. Emerging in the minds of students, maybe as something that I haven't seen before, but I like the analogy of thinking about the frame and the gutter in comics, and comparing that to the line and the line break, or the space on the page. And I think using, this idea of these fragments of form, among these two very different genres has been a really interesting way to approach teaching both of them, so that these two kinds of modes can talk back and forth to each other.
That's a cool thought, and it reminds me of a line of thought that I have been pursuing for a while, and I often try to put this to my students in some way that hopefully they'll take away with them, whereas the author of the prototypical book in prose, such as a novel, writes a manuscript, which is then sort of seamlessly flows through the text block of the book. Makers of comics and makers of lyric poetry, or poetry generally, make pages. They don't just make a scrolling thing that then gets typeset and set into pages by someone else. They make pages, and I'm thinking about the historical relationship between the typewriter and modern lyric poetry, and how poets are concerned with the appearance of their constellations of words, their lines, their lines and line links and line breaks on the page, And I think about the use of negative space in comics vis-a-vis the use of negative space in lyric poetry, where often our experience of poetry, I think, is intensified by seeing a short, powerful poem delivered in a cradled in white space. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's something about lots of books of poetry, and it's like you see this in comics too, where there'll be moments in, let's say, in the work of Chester Brown or John Porcellino or Eleanor Davis, where you expect there to be panels because you've been conditioned by the hyperframe and by panels running top to bottom, wall to wall, and they don't have panels; they have blankness. And my gosh, that really speaks when you see it, especially if you're used to a sort of rectilinear grid layout common in Western comics, and then you see that part of the grid is empty. That's powerful, and it reminds me a lot of the effects that lyric poetry can have. There's a brilliant moment in one of John Porcellino's King Cat comics that I've been teaching for the last couple of years, where the already incredibly spare artwork, if you know John Porcellino's King Cat, you know it's incredibly it dissolves even further, almost down to nothing. And it's a moment of high stress and pending loss and existential questioning. It's just a very profound moment where the page is almost emptied out of anything. Right. And you know, Porcellino is one of those cartoonists who looks to haiku and other short verse forms as a model. So thinking about, that what you said, Krystal, that analogy really rings for me in a big way.
Awesome.
I mean, all this is really exciting. The project that I'm preparing to do this fall is with a teacher who has a class of students in the Puente program. You may be familiar with that, being Californians now. But it's really, Latino-centered literature, but really meant to be for diverse communities of students. And, one of the decisions this teacher made is that he wanted to do this graphic novel unit that we're preparing to do right at the start of the school year in his English language arts classroom, because we talked about how it becomes a jumping point to talk about dialogue and then to read the novel, in sort of like a continuity. And then it's also a jumping point to talk about poetry and verse in terms of the selectiveness and representation of image and use of the page and all the things that you were just talking about, Charles, as far as negative space. And then also as a means of a jumping off point to talk about social and political commentary. We're going to read March as well, and American-Born Chinese is in there as well. And so for them to think about the social and cultural and political dimensions of a narrative, comics is a great kind of hotbed for that stuff.
Well, this raises a question, I think, which is the advantages and challenges of leading off with a comic. I wanted to ask all of you as teachers, have you ever started a children's literature themed syllabus, started it with a comic?
Yes.
I don't believe I have. I'm searching my memory. Have you?
I don't think I have.
I've written an essay about how I try to start off with picture books, chapter books, film, and then move into comics. And I actually recommend that for beginning teachers. In other words, if someone's listening to this and they're thinking about incorporating some of these comics into their syllabus, I really would recommend moving into it slowly. But I also think that there's an advantage to beginning a course with comics, because a lot of times I think we worry too much about our students' abilities to catch up. And I almost think I enjoy the shock value.
Spoken like a teacher.
Well, I'm thinking about, you were talking about Luke Pearson's Hilda series, and, that comic, I swear, I said to Paul, I felt like I'd taken an amphetamine when I picked up the most recent volume, because everything was happening so quickly and there was so much going on in the page. And I'm an experienced comics reader. At least, I've read thousands of comics, and I just had to sit down after a minute and go, whoa, I can't catch my breath. And I thought, I want my students to feel this.
Have you ever taught? Are you familiar with the Secret Science Alliance by Eleanor Davis?
I'm aware of it. I haven't taught.
My gosh. It is busy beyond busy. In fact, my colleague Craig Fisher is the one who introduced it to me, and he said, I want you to consider this comic as a spoof of Chris Ware for young readers.
That's a great way, yeah.
That's not far off, actually. The amount of diagrammatic craziness going on the pages and stuff. Yeah, the Pearsons can. Yeah, it's revved up. I don't know. I mean,
Well, I think about someone like Barry Deutsch, whom Krystal's going to teach in the fall. And, Barry started off as a political cartoonist, and he often does his cartoons in just one panel. And the attention to detail that has to come in when you're trying to convey a political point in one panel, right? Mm-hmm. So his comics I like to start off with because he's so technically sound that students don't have trouble following him. In fact, I can teach most of the basic formal elements of comics using that. But now I'm beginning to think that maybe I should stop. Isn't it great? You write an essay, you suggest something to other people, and then you say, what? I'm now going to just throw them in. So I think in the spring, I'm just going to go ahead and start off with a Pearson comic and say, okay, kids, jump in, let's talk. Because I think sometimes when you make people feel uneasy, they actually learn more because they have to work so hard, right? So I don't know. We'll see.
I love that notion of rising to comics, though, of graduating to comics that, putting it at the end does, right? That's awesome.
It's contrary to the usual cultural script about comics. Right. That's why I love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, right. And I think that certainly is something that my students come to appreciate. And that's one of the things they say at the end of the semester is, I'm glad we worked up to this because now I appreciate it more. And I get that, right? But on the other hand, I'm feeling, just a little feisty. And I just kind of want to dip people in. So now I have to look at the Davis comic. Maybe I'll start off with those two comics in the spring semester. Happy New Year, kids.
I do think about literacy a lot in terms of in the framework of culturally relevant or culturally sustaining pedagogy, and how if you're trying to teach kids and with early adolescence, you're trying to teach them things like close reading, eventually in their whatever AP they're going to have to do close reading, that they have these tremendous resources for reading visual texts and visual literature, that they can bring to bear. And so as a means of talking about how to do close reading and how to connect things like like body image or the Gothic, to their readings of these narratives that they just enjoy. I feel like that's where comics opens up all these spaces where, they bring the awesome stuff that they have. It just reminds me of how, often the children will lead you, like the kids will kind of guide you into what's powerful and where their resources allow them to do amazing things.
True. I feel like I could cry. This is so awesome. Well, no, it's so exciting to talk about children's comics with other people who are interested in children's comics, because that still is kind of a little bit of a hard sell. In children's lit, I think a lot of our colleagues who are already trying to keep up with children's literature, many of them weren't trained in children's lit, so maybe they have another field on top of that, and then this is yet another field. And what got me into it in the first place was I felt I was doing a really poor job teaching picture books. And that sort of interested me at a really sort of profound level, is to really understand how to talk about images and text. And then right at the same time that I was grappling with that, all of a sudden you had this huge explosion of comics with Jean Lewin Yang and a number of other comics creators coming out at the same time, Hope Larson, others with really amazing comics. And I realized, okay, I love this. And I'm going to go back. When I was a kid, I loved comics. Some of my most important learning moments were with comics. Very often comics I wasn't supposed to be reading, at least to society, because my parents were fine with whatever I read. But the point is that, that's really how I came into this. And it's exciting now to be at a place where there's a growing number of people who are invested in children's comics, who have the time, who can make the time, or who just love it passionately. And it's so exciting to have that community really developing.
It's something that, you mentioned, Gwen, that you're working on a book that has to do with the history of connections or relations between comics and children's literature, right?
Right.
And to me, that kind of thing sounds, that work as you described it to us, I'll say, it sounds so exciting because it's really a way of reconsidering the history of comics in toto. Right, all of it. The disavowal of children's entertainment or children's culture within comic studies is, I think we, coming at it from the comic studies point of view, I think and hope that we are finally getting or have gotten past that point. One thing that has been interesting to me is I've been a almost lifelong or time out of mind sort of comic book hobbyist, and I've spent a lot of time in comic shops, good shops, bad shops. From the this is your attic and I'm making change. This is my attic you're in, and I'm making change out of a cigar box, to the more sophisticated shops of today, and it constantly forces me into a reconsideration of the history and scope of comics, seeing a historiography of comics that is not written from within the fairly narrow straits of the kind of fandom that, whether I knew it or not, was sort of what I was coming up in as a kid. I think coming back to the Eisners, circling back to that, it's an interesting thing about the Eisners. They, the judges work hard to create a diverse ballot, and the judges typically include experts in children's literature or children's publishing or literacy learning. They typically often include librarians. There's a conscious effort of inclusion toward inclusion in the judges. The judges prepare this interesting ballot. And then I think what very often happens in the ballot, I speak as a one-time judge, not to be cynical about this, but what often happens is that the work that has the most draw or biggest presence within the direct market, that is within comic book stores, is likely to win off on the ballot. But I think when it comes to the younger reader-focused categories, that might be an exception to that. I can't prove this, but I have a sense that children's and young adult librarians have a lot of shaping power over the Eisners, not only in the ballot, but in the results for those younger reader-focused categories, which is cool. I think that's really cool, and I think that children's literature and children's literature studies is part of the ongoing, very tense project of the diversification of comics culture in North America, certainly in the United States, and it's part of those arguments, and has to be.
Yeah, and the sad thing is I have 80,000 words for the entire book, and so about 20,000 words for the chapter history. So, Charles, I think what you're going to find is there's still a lot more that can be written about this. and you maybe need to be joining me in this, because I really would love to. You have so much wonderful experience, and every time we talk, I learn so much. So,
thank you.
Yeah, that 80,000, I'll tell you, that's all I think about right now.
I appreciate your comments earlier about depictions of childhood, even in texts that are not typically seen as being directed towards children, as well as the texts that were directed towards children, but now are only sort of the purview of the old school comic book fan, I've been writing about Jack Kirby's Commandy, The Last Boy on Earth, for some time, which I think is a children's comic, but it's hardly ever received as such. It's not talked about as such, because it's a Kirby comic, and Kirby's sort of taken up into the mantle of comic book fandom writ large, or superhero fandom at large, or whatever. But it's a book that says in its title it's about a boy, and and that. I want to, and I hope to at least bring some of my children's literature experience. I have a lot of research to do, I think, in this when it comes to trying to publish on that particular work. I mean, to talk about boys in series fiction, or construction of boyhood, or boyhood in sort of colonialist adventure fiction, which is certainly Commandy has something in common with that. It has a lot in common with that. We just don't see it sometimes. We don't.
It's funny you say that, because I'm just finishing up a very short 4,000 word essay Not that I'm paying attention this summer, but on the depiction of actual children in Tintin. And I mean, if you can just step aside for a moment and argue that Tintin is not a child, technically he's not a child. There are only 3 children in the entire series, and that to me is fascinating in and of itself. By the way, just so y'all know, Charles is like making some great comments on the method. That really, I wish we could include his screen captures into the show notes because they're so awesome. His commentary is wonderful. But anyway,
I'm just trying to disrupt the program.
Rock with that. But anyway, that a lot of times if you ask someone, they'll say, well, yeah, no, Tintin, that's a kid's comic. But actually, really it's not necessarily, or at least not in the traditional way that we might think it. And so, yeah, I think there's lots of ways to disrupt this idea of what we mean by children's comics. I think we have a long, long way to go before we will be finished. I don't think we'll ever be finished with it, but with, discussing what we even mean by that phrase.
I think the depiction of adults in children's text, because adults are fun to make fun of. That's part of what happens in Tintin, I think. But I've noticed this in like picture book biographies of famous figures, how they remain sort of infantilized throughout the narrative. I'm thinking of some of the biographies of artists like Diego Rivera, picture book biography I taught in children's literature some years ago, where Diego remains. I mean, there's a sense that he's grown from childhood to adulthood, but it's really not reflected either visually or in any change in the narrative voice or characterization. Maybe you've seen this in some. There's a sense that the adults in these picture book bios of famous people still continue to be very much that sort of young coming of age protagonist right through to the very end. That's interesting because you have. Real sometimes momentous historical figures that are rendered sympathetic through the things that, let's say, the picture book does as a genre, or that children's books broadly do as a genre. And so that makes me wonder about, like, Tintin's clearly a children's comic that is not populated with kids as characters, but yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about that when I was reading book 3 of March, and they were mentioning Fannie Lou Hamer, and thinking about Carol Boston Weatherford's picture book, Voice of Freedom, which I had just read, in that same, because it was really, really interesting to see that segment in book 3 of March that really focused on her as a character, and then to compare that to the picture book biography that I had just read a week or so ago. And even just the way on the cover that her figure was depicted, and learning different things about, thinking about the audience for the picture book versus the audience for this comic book.
You know what's a stunningly good biography ostensibly for young readers in comics form that really departs from a lot of the conventions for young readers' biography is Joe Lambert's comic Annie Sullivan and the Trials of Helen Keller. Do you know this book?
I know it. I haven't read it.
Oh my gosh.
Same.
I so wanted to teach it in my disability and comics seminar this last semester. It was one of my one of the impetuses, or whatever the word is, for teaching the course in the first place, and it's gone out of print. And I went on eBay and bought like 12 copies and turned my office into a lending library just so my grad students could have this book. It's stunning. I mean, of course, it partakes in the usual unavoidable irony in that it's a book that uses a visual medium ingeniously to try to convey an experience of not only deafness but of blindness, and that can never help but be bitterly ironic, I think. But no, if you haven't read it, Disney's Hyperion label published it as part of a series of graphic bios produced by the Center for Cartoon Studies. So there's the Amelia Earhart book, the Thoreau book, the Houdini book, and so on. All of them are good, but this book, Annie Sullivan, The Trials of Helen Keller, my gosh, it's and it left me in a very question-asking place when I was done. The cartooning's brilliant. The evocation of a sightless experience, again, ironically through a kind of visual medium. The evocation of touch through image that Lambert manages that is kind of kinesthetic business of trying to find ways of rendering touch, palpation, haptic experience through visuals. And it's not triumphant either. That's another thing about the book. It is not triumphant. It left me in a very sort of problem-posing kind of place. But it's that's a great one. And even though it's more than a handful of years old now, that's a book I should have mentioned right at the outset because it just floors me. It's really stupendous.
Oh, gotta see that. Gotta read that.
If not anything, I'm developing a wonderful reading list based on everybody's recommendations today. It's great.
Same here.
Although I'm really beginning to think that for the show notes, if Paul and I are ever going to survive, we should just say, just listen.
That's right.
We'll be here all day. Cause I think we maybe have mentioned 30 titles, 40 titles at this point. It's like, oh my God.
Let me one other that I found at Comic-Con, which is Poppies of Iraq. Have you heard about this book?
Oh, yes.
Vijit Findakli and Louis Trondheim. It premiered at the Drawn and Quarterly booth and it's the only book of new comics I got at Comic-Con. And it's Vijit Findakli's memoirs of childhood, primarily childhood, growing up in Iraq as part of in effect, a religious minority, part of a Christian, Orthodox Christian family in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, or the Iraq that becomes Saddam Hussein's Iraq. It's very episodic. The drawings are like little cameos, unbounded, unbordered frames. They're really not frames against white space. The people are all drawn in a highly schematized, it's tempting to say childlike cartoon style by Louis Trondheim. The watercoloring is by Vijit Findakli, so it's based on her memories, and she wrote it with Trondheim, and he cartooned it up, and then she colored it. But it's really cool, and it sits interestingly alongside, of course, the very well-known Satrapi's Persepolis, which also filters war and oppression through a child's kind of ingenuous sensibility. And Poppies of Iraq, while being aesthetically very, very different, complements it really well and has a lot of sort of up in the air or open-ended childhood anecdotes about things remembered. It might compare to Raed Satouf's Arab of the Future, which is a little more alarming and vicious, I think. But Poppies of Iraq is bittersweet, and boy, it taught me a lot.
I can't wait to read it, Charles.
It's that category of books that use childhood to leverage other things also that you mentioned, so it might be a cool read alongside Emil Ferris or somebody else.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, guys. Well, this has been amazing. Just really have to say I've so enjoyed our discussion today.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much.
It's been a heady experience for me. I feel like not only the extensive list of titles that we now have to add to the recommendation list, but also all of the theoretical terrain that we've walked through. It really sort of energizes me for the mission I think that Gwen and I are on in being the Comics Alternative Young Readers episodes that, by no means are we just a small segment. I'm just so attracted to the notion that, Charles, you mentioned earlier about how, it is a vantage point through which to view sort of, the whole of comics, to consider the presence of children and also the presence of childhood as an aspect of how we think about comics. So anyway, all this has just been super, super stimulating. I'm so inspired.
May I just say on a personal note, Krystal, I'm thrilled that you're joining the CSUN community and,
Me too.
and
Cheers.
Bringing not only comics, but comics in the context of these other formerly inventive genres and these other perspectives that you're bringing to it. And I think that as childhood studies grows and becomes more and more of a thing at Cal State Northridge, that having we have this comics element that I think we can bring to the table, and I know it's going to invigorate both the liberal studies and English programs, and it's certainly going to invigorate my teaching as I steal all kinds of ideas from you.
Oh.
So welcome, and that's really cool. I've never actually worked with anyone here at CSUN before within English or liberal studies who has published on comics.
Oh, wow.
And so my colleague Francis Gateward in Cinema and TV Arts has published award-winning work, Eisner Award-winning work on comics. Yeah. He's awesome. So I look forward to introducing you to Francis Gateward. But within the College of Humanities and within liberal studies in English, I just haven't had the opportunity to work alongside or in cahoots with someone who's published on comics and in the context of other innovative texts. So awesome.
Yay. Thank you so much, Charles. I am delighted to be at CSUN and so happy to have you as a colleague. I'm just really looking forward to the next year and collaborating and
let's make trouble. Let's make trouble.
Yes. I have to say, I like the word cahoots. So, maybe the way we can end today is to say that maybe we should come back in a period of time, maybe a couple months, maybe a year, and see how things are going in children's comics with this lineup, and because I'll be interested. Every year it seems like my understanding of comics grows so much, and the field keeps changing. It just we have a lot to think about and talk about in the subject matter. But it has been such a pleasure today. Young readers cheer! Yay! So
awesome! Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you both.
Gwen, I just want to thank you for setting up that conversation because, man, I had a good time. Folks would probably tell that I was really, really, inspired, and that was fun.
I'm just really, as you said earlier, you were on cloud nine. That's pretty much how I feel. It's so exciting to talk about comics with people who are passionate about them. And obviously Charles and Krystal are just amazing scholars. And boy, I'll tell you, if you were in the Southern California area, thinking about going to Cal State Northridge, boy, you have got some amazing professors there waiting for you. But yeah, it was a wonderful conversation today. I always feel like I learned so much when I talked to you, when I talked to Charles and Krystal. So I hope everyone really enjoyed it. And we'll probably do some more of these types of shows in the future. It's really great to get, I'd love for us to get some comics creators on to talk a little bit about their experiences writing directly for children. I know we've been able to do that in some of our interview shows before, but it would be fun to get a roundtable like that going as well. And next month, though, we will be back to our traditional comics reviewing for August, and so stay tuned for that. There's a number of good books coming out for young readers this month and early next month, so Paul and I will be on top of that, and we'll come back to a normal format starting in August.
Absolutely, and thank you for listening, everybody, because we do hope you enjoyed that content and that conversation, and that whether you are an educator, a librarian, or just interested in comics, just enjoy the medium and works in it. I think that conversation really touched on the ways that thinking about children's comics, obviously exciting for children, exciting for teachers and parents and librarians and educators and so forth, but just also really important in any consideration in the field more generally. So I loved that discussion, and I'm grateful, Gwen, for you for setting it up and including me.
Well, it was just wonderful to have you there. It was a great time.
Yep. And we definitely want to thank our sponsor as well.
Yeah, I was so excited to thank them. I jumped right in. You go ahead.
Sorry, I cut you off, but you're gonna want to go to DCB Service and their sister company In Stock Trades, and you're gonna have comics priced at 30, 40, 50% off, as we mentioned. And when you do get your comics there, it'd be awesome for us if you reach out to them and let them know, that Gwen and Paul sent you, and that all the extensive list of comics that we mentioned you'd be able to find at DCBS or at In Stock Trades. Most all of them, I think, and so let them know that we sent you there.
Absolutely. And if you want to talk to us, please contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com. And on the right-hand side of your browser, you're going to see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. You can click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to contact us the old school way, and believe me, I like to imagine listeners doing that, picking up that phone and with the rotary dial especially, you can call us on the telephone at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by mail at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Paul, how can folks reach you?
Folks can reach me at paul@comicsalternative.com. And you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content that's always coming out to our podcast, and updates to our blog as well. We're on Twitter at 2guys, the number 2 guys with PhDs. You can find the Comics Alternative on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and Spotify too. And YouTube as well. You can find us at our YouTube channel. Subscribe. It helps when you subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. Helps also when you rate and review the podcast. We always like to give shout outs. I know Derek and Andy always do, to new reviews on iTunes, and you can stream us on Stitcher and tune in, and all of the extensive back catalog, the long history of Comics Alternative episodes there at comicsalternative.com. So much good stuff there, and hopefully some good stuff today. So thank you. And Gwen, you want to take us out?
Yeah, it's been great today. Folks, keep reading those children's comics, and we will see you next month.
All right. Bye-bye.